The Consortium of Classical Educators provides resources and regional connections for Christian families, teachers, and educational organizations to expand the reach of classical education and foster human flourishing for generations to come.
All right, well, thank you all so much for being here. Thank you for coming back from lunch to be here. I appreciate it. It's funny, I'll start with a brief story about the title of this because, outside of these circles that we're all part of, I imagine most of you are familiar with G.H. Chesterton, The Democracy of the Dead. You've probably heard this before, but a lot of people haven't. And so my sister is here today with me, and she was telling some of her coworkers about it. And they thought we were talking about raising people from the dead. And so I assumed that no paranormal activities during this. That's down the road somewhere. I don't know. That's not here. But I guess Tim already introduced me really well, so I don't need to tell you about myself. But I will tell you, all those beautiful hovers are not designed by me, but the awesome people at the Unexpected Journal. So it's excellent, and my team is amazing, and I love them. But yeah, I'm not the artist. That makes them look great. But let's get on with today's talk. So our objectives today, we have three. First of all, we're going to talk about what the Democracy of the Dead is. And a lot of you may be familiar with it, but for those of you who aren't, well, we'll start there. Then, number two, we're going to understand, okay, just because we understand why something is, it doesn't necessarily tell us why we should hear about it, why it's worth preserving, or really why we should even talk about this. So that will be step number two. And finally, well, given the title of my presentation, I think that, I consider it worth preserving. So there'll be a practical element at the end where we talk about, okay, how do we do this? And I use some kind of bold words there. I call it countercultural, and I talk about preservation. And those are kind of heavier words. So we'll try to unpack those a little bit as we draw near the end. So it's going to be a pretty fast-moving 45 minutes, but I hope that we now come away with something we can apply to our educational pursuits after this. So to start off, what is the Democracy of the Dead? And we're going to start with Chesterton, with obviously the root source of this term. As you can see, he wrote, tradition means giving votes to the most obscure of all classes, our ancestors. It is the democracy of the dead. Tradition refuses to submit to the small and arrogant oligarchy of those who merely happen to be walking about. So there's a lot of heavy terms in there. We'll have to figure out what democracy is. We'll have to figure out what oligarchy is. We'll have to understand why they're arrogant and why they're small. Why are they any smaller than what we are, or than anything else? So, and who are our ancestors? Are we suggesting that all of history is equally valuable? I don't know. We'll have to find out in a minute. But ultimately, what this question boils down to is the relationship between the past and you. So how do they connect together? Obviously, Chesterton, he's talking about ancestors. He's also talking about people walking about. So there's this question of how do we balance out the past and what value should we give to those who've gone before it? Should we even care as something that's gone out of date? Does it retain any value at all? Or maybe it doesn't. And that was what Chesterton was wrestling with in orthodoxy. So for the ease of our understanding here, I've prepared two contrasting views. The first is the traditional view, playing off of, obviously Chesterton uses that term tradition. And it's rather, it's a loaded term because first of all, inherent in his quote from orthodoxy is this idea that the past is as valuable as the present. So I didn't see when Tim said I was from Vermont, but anybody else from Vermont in here? Yes, okay. So do you all have town meetings in your towns in Vermont? Do you all have? Yeah, so for those of you who aren't familiar with the town meeting in Vermont, small towns have them, and you go in and any citizen of the town can vote. And it's about as pure a form of democracy as you're going to get. They put up the school budget. It's a yay or nay vote. Whoever shows up, that's who votes on it. And so in my head, when I think about this, when I hear the democracy of the dead, I'm picturing these meetings, and I'm picturing this idea that, okay, the people from the past have a vote just like I have a vote. It doesn't mean they're more important than me. It doesn't mean that I'm more important than them, but we're on this equal playing field and we have a vote and we're considering. All right, so we're going to put all the options on the table, like a budget, like how something like a capital expense, whatever you have in your town, the people vote for it. So in this case, ideas are on the table. History is on the table. And so the question then becomes, whose voice matters? And the first thing to note is that the past and the present receive an equal vote. And point number 2 is really important, because sometimes we look back at the past and we assume, oh man, like those were the good old days. It was so much better then. And the world is falling apart. And we just don't quite understand why. And if we had only turned back the clock, it would absolutely be better. And I don't think Chesterton would agree with that, because the democracy of the dead implies a relationship in the other direction as well. Just as much as my vote doesn't matter more than theirs, their vote doesn't matter more than mine. And I might, we can improve on things, believe it or not. It's hard to believe, but sometimes things can get better. They don't always have to get worse. So we don't want to idolize the past immediately. And this is obviously point number 3, we don't disregard the past. There's a temptation sometimes, and we'll get more into this when we talk about the other view, which I call the modern view, so we'll jump to that in a minute. But sometimes we just write off the past because it's hard, or we can't remember it, or there's too much of it. I mean, that happens. Sometimes there's so much stuff. How can I possibly know everything there is to know in the past and all these great ideas? Any of you who are familiar with Adler's Great Books of the Western World, it's a major set of books. A large set of, I believe it's 66 volumes. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but that's a lot to know. And it can be overwhelming. So sometimes it's easier just to be like, well, the past doesn't, I'm just not going to pay that much attention because it's too hard. Obviously, Chesterton, he is telling us that tradition is valuable, so therefore we should not disregard the past. It also gives the past a fair hearing. We've probably all been irritated in a situation where we have a side of the story and someone else does, and the stories don't quite match up. They have something, right? And it's frustrating because I know what I saw is true, and they're telling something that's completely different. And I think that's important to do with the past, too, is that when we allow people to have a seat at the table, when we truly have a democracy of the dead, where someone like Plato can speak for himself, and we read Plato, we don't read interpretations of Plato, we read Plato, and we let Plato speak for himself. Now he has a fair hearing. And I mean, a lot of you have probably read the Republic in this room. There's some amazing stuff in the Republic. There's also some highly questionable stuff that you read it and you're like, oh, I'm glad they're not in charge of my city. You see that happen sometimes. But he has a fair hearing. We put it on the table, and again, go back to my Vermont Town Hall illustration. There's enough voices that tell me, okay, maybe Plato is really smart, but maybe Plato didn't have everything right. He gets a fair hearing, but we don't automatically accept. That's back to point number 2 about the idolatry. We don't just love it because it's old. And finally, of course, at the bottom, we can learn from the past. Obviously, the past can inform our present decisions if we respect tradition. People who disregard tradition, they don't have that benefit. But if we respect tradition, we can learn from what they did well, we can learn from what they did bad. And sometimes it's not even a matter of good or bad. It's a matter of, I thought this was a new idea, and it's really not all that revolutionary. Someone talked about it hundreds of years ago. You tend to see that, in education, for lack of a better way. Sometimes trends come and go, and hear it when we're having conversations about classical education. It's not like we're the first people to think of this. This is a tradition that expands back. And so we can use that positive to inform our present decisions. Now, in contrast to this, I'm calling it the modern view. Chesterton obviously did not use that word, but for lack of a better word, that's the word I've chosen. The modern, so the small and arrogant oligarchy of those who happen to be walking about. If they're arrogant, they think they're pretty good, and that implies that they would tend to believe the present is better than the past. So if it's newer, it must be better. It's an inherently progressive system, and I don't mean that politically, I'm not using that term in that way, but it's kind of a trajectory term in that the future will be better than the past. And that can be true, and it can be false, but the modern is committed to that progressive vision that the future will be better than the past. Then point number 2, of course, it turns the present into an idol. So if the present is more valuable than the past, we're almost deifying the present. We're saying the present is the best that anything possibly can be. And that's really dangerous when you do anything to that level. Like I said about the past, we don't want to idolize that. The moderns err when they idolize the present. Point number 3, of course, we forget the past. Because if the present is inherently more valuable than the past, who cares? Like, why should we waste our time on stuff that's worse? We should assume the better. And finally, I suggested this one I'll have to unpack a little bit, but the past receives a slanted hearing. Now, what I mean by that is, okay, these are worldviews, right? We have a worldview, we look at history. And the moderns have a worldview, and they're looking at history. And we come to different conclusions. Now, for us, or I assume at least most of us in this room, we believe that we can learn from the past and we ought to at least listen to it. The moderns don't have that luxury. They have to come to the conclusion that anything in the past is necessarily worse. Now, what happens when objective reality collides with that worldview? What if there's something in the past, just for an example, and I don't think this will be very controversial, but this is just kind of the state of the family, right? And there are a lot more broken homes and problems in affecting families in our world today than perhaps there were in the past. Now for us, we can say, okay, maybe they had something right in the past. The modern does not have that luxury. But they have the objective reality that maybe data is worse or something like that is worse, and there's more evidence of problems. So they can't admit the past was better, but they realize the past was better. So what do? They have to slant their view of history. Somehow, they have to turn the past to make it appear worse, even if it wasn't actually worse. And that really isn't a good way to do history if you have to twist it to fit your preconceived agenda. And so the moderns have a tendency to do that. And finally, again, if the past isn't that valuable, then we don't need to incorporate it into our decisions. It doesn't matter. And so that's really kind of a critical distinction between the two. And I think some of you might be more familiar with C.S. Lewis and Surprised by Joy, where he talks about chronological snobbery. Now this is him, this is an autobiographical work. And he says, in the first place, Owen Barfield made short work of what I've called my chronological snobbery. The uncritical acceptance of the intellectual climate common to our own age, and the assumption that whatever has gone out of date is by that account discredited. So you can kind of see the modern view at play in that. Lewis admitted he had that himself, and that was, decades ago at this point, not quite a century ago, but decades ago. And he rightfully recognized that he just assumed that newer had to be better. He accepted this, again, inherently progressive ideology that everything always has to get better and will continually improve. We can continually improve, but that's not guaranteed. And that's where the uncritical part comes into play. So just for one more illustration before we advance, I like to think of it like an iceberg. And the modern view is kind of like just seeing the top of an iceberg. It's real and it's important, and you don't want to run your ship into it. It would be really bad. It's part of reality that we have to acknowledge. But the modern doesn't realize that icebergs tend to be a lot larger underwater. They tend to be huge, and I'm not a science person by any means, but I certainly know they tend to be much larger underneath. And that's what we recognize. As believers in tradition, we recognize that, okay, there is support under here for everything that holds up modernity. We have to recognize that, and we acknowledge that, and we celebrate that, and that's an awesome thing. The moderns, though, only have the top part of the iceberg, which it's just an incomplete picture of reality. And so I think this is some of what Chesterton is trying to hit at through his illustration of the democracy of the dead. But the question is, why does all this matter? I mean, that might be the question a more skeptical audience might have, is why should we preserve it? Even if everything I said is true, I haven't really disproven the modern view. I've only explained how they're different. And so I'm going to start you with a quote from Carl Trueman. You might have read The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, brilliant book if you haven't. And it's not really on the theme of the democracy of the dead, but I thought this quote was really helpful for our purposes about doing history. The basic principle is this: no individual historical phenomenon is its own cause. The French Revolution did not cause the French Revolution. Every historical phenomenon is a result of a wide variety of factors that can vary from the technological to the political and to the philosophical. So, the democracy of the dead, first of all, it accurately reflects history. So as we, there we go. It accurately reflects history. So, again, back to the iceberg illustration. The French Revolution would be like the iceberg above water. The French Revolution is the result that we all see. If we're living in that time in history, we see our country, if we're in France, kind of like melting down in front of us, and we're wondering what on earth is going on. But it was a long road that led to the French Revolution. It wasn't just, Louis and Marie Antoinette, and all of a sudden everything blew up. There was a long road that led to that point. And so, similarly, as believers in Chesterton's Democracy of the Dead, we're able to acknowledge that, and we're allowed to say, no, there's all of these things that happened before that therefore move us to where we are now. And we're even allowed to say that maybe something that we're doing now isn't that ideal. Like maybe we're in a spot that we shouldn't be in. Maybe to, again, continue with the French Revolution example, maybe you wonder, have we unleashed something that's worth unleashing? And that's a question that can be had, but in order to answer that question, we need to know where we came from, what we turned over, and is it now better or worse? We can only evaluate that if we believe the past is something worth talking about. Now, advancing to Dr. Robert Woods. Now, Kepler people might be familiar with Dr. Woods. He was a professor of mine at Faulkner as well. He wrote this book, Dwelling on Delphi, which I highly recommend for anyone involved in classical education. But he wrote this, The Humanist. Now, when he uses the term humanist, he's talking about Christian humanism. I'm not going to unpack all that right now, but this isn't like secular humanism. So just, it's not like a contradiction here that, doesn't secular humanism seek to dethrone God? No, he's talking about Christian humanism. Instead, through the moral disciplines of humanitas, he aspires to struggle towards the Godhead. And the key word here is struggle, because ultimately human judgment is imperfect. As much as I want to believe that I'm always right, it's not true. I hate to disappoint you all, but, and that applies to anyone. Like I used Plato before. Plato didn't get everything right, even though Plato had a lot right. And how better to ultimately kind of correct the excesses of our own age than to maybe look at someone else's age. Maybe look at another time in history, maybe look at another place in the world and consider, all right, here's how it went there. Maybe I can now learn a lesson from there, bring it back to my time and apply it in my situation. I like how Dr. Woods mentions that the struggle towards the Godhead. Because as Christians, we're certainly on this path towards sanctification, but it's work. We have to try. And knowledge works a similar way. We know something of God, right? I hope. We study our Bibles, we learn things, we try, but we certainly don't have perfect knowledge of God yet. And we don't even have perfect knowledge of His creation yet. So how much more important is it to continue that struggle? But in order to realize that we have to struggle towards the Godhead, we have to recognize that we're not God, and we don't have all knowledge, and our way right now is maybe not the best way of all time. We may have to reconsider. And so that's something really important that, again, as believers in tradition, we can accept. The moderns, they can accept a form of this. They can believe that we're moving one direction towards a better future. But they can accept that maybe we're going down the wrong path and we have to turn around and get back on track. Whereas we hope we don't have to do that, but our worldview allows us to do that. And that corresponds better with reality. Now, I recently read this book called Dedicated by Pete Davis. And I think it was a commencement address that he expanded into a book. But I really like this quote from it. Why is commitment necessary to change? Because change happens slow, not fast. Everything that matters takes time. There are no shortcuts. So the obvious thing to take away from that is that positive change, it takes time. And the really exciting part about embracing the democracy of the dead is that we have thousands of years of history to draw from. And we have that time. And we can even recognize that we can trace the conversation back through time and see this person was responding to that person who was responding to that person. We have the luxury to see these developments. We have the luxury to actually embrace all of this improvement. There's another really interesting, I referred to the great books of the Western world earlier, but the most valuable volume that comes from this is called the Syntopicon. And what Adler did is he tried to kind of trace great ideas like fate or free will or good and evil. And he would try to trace them through this massive collection of books. It's an admirable effort. And it's an enjoyable read because you can see, again, over thousands of years, you can see these conversations going back and forth and back and forth. Maybe we erred too far one way, now we pull it back this way. We can allow for positive change taking time. The modern, if you think about building a tower, every generation of moderns have to start over a new tower because they can't accept that the previous tower has any structural integrity. They have to tear it down or leave it sitting there and forget about it. For us, we're able to build on top of that tower. And maybe we'll realize the builders weren't that great and they messed up a little bit and we have to fix stuff. But we have somewhere to start from. And better yet, we won't make the same mistakes as we build up. So again, positive change, assuming that, again, we want positive change, and I hope we all would agree to that, it can take millennia. We're still learning from, like, a Jewish carpenter who died 2 millennia ago. We're still learning from him, so it takes time. And that's awesome and good, and something that we are allowed to celebrate. And finally, we're going to return to Dr. Woods. And he suggests this, and this is such a great quote, again, from dwelling on Delphi. One of the many advantages of reading the great books is that the truly great books, so again, not just books that we call great, but truly great books, have the ability to remove us from our present moment and take us somewhere else, expose us to different ideas, issues, and landscapes, and then return us to our own. So because, it's come up that I've taught a Tolkien class before, I have to give my obligatory Tolkien reference. And I have no quotes from Tolkien, shockingly, in this presentation. And so the Bilbo Baggins goes on an adventure, and he returns home. And Gandalf tells him that he seems like a changed hobbit when he returns home. What changed him? It was the lesson that was being removed from his environment, going into a different environment, learning lessons in that environment, and bringing them back home to his environment. So maybe we're not physically moving across the country or moving across the world, but ideologically, what Dr. Woods is suggesting is that we are able to read, I can read Thomas Aquinas and imagine being in his world that's a lot different than my world right now. I can read from what Charles Dickens came up earlier, and I don't live in Great Britain, unfortunately. Those kinds of things are possible through the great books if they're truly great. And by truly great, it means having the ability to take you there and bring you back, and give you something to bring back. Because obviously you can read, historical fiction that does nothing for you intellectually, right? There's bad historical fiction out there. And if it's not enough to just be taken to another world, but to also have something to come back to change you, and for educators in this room to change your students, because that's really significant. And honestly, the great traditions, they've endured. That's the beauty of it. They've endured. If Christianity has been challenged since it started in the book of Acts, there were already people saying, oh, well, it's not actually Pentecost, they're just drunk. I mean, it's already been challenged from the get-go. What value is there in something that's held up over time? Again, something can be wrong. It's possible for even a long-held tradition to be wrong. But you have more confidence that something that's held up for a long time, if it's been challenged for hundreds or thousands of years, and it's held true, and it's withstood the challenges that it's faced. So I think that's a really kind of important way to frame why the democracy of the dead is valuable. So if we want, let's see here, all right, to represent history accurately, which I hope we do, I hope we're all committed to that in this room. If we want to account for our own shortcomings, I suggested that, human nature, we're flawed people and we're working on it, but we might not have everything right. We ought not have the arrogance to believe that we're the only people in the whole history of mankind to have everything right. If we want to avoid rash decisions, again, back to the tower building, right? If every new generation builds a tower, that structure's gonna fall. It's rash and it's hasty because you're rushing to build it before you die and everybody forgets about you. Our view allows the good to last, honestly, forever. The good can last generations and generations and be passed on by places like classical schools. And finally, if we're going to choose ideas that they really best represent reality, I suggested that the modern view sometimes has to contort reality to sustain their assumption that the present is always better than the past. We want the democracy of the dead. That's what we ultimately want. We ought to want, right? The democracy of the dead. Because it starts with a desire for wanting this and for respecting this and for listening to it. Why? Because our cultural trend is swimming in the other direction. We're told to forget about history or forget about certain parts of history. There's all kinds of things that we're told. And if we want to preserve the democracy of the dead, we have to want it. We ought to want it. And of course, now as we come to nearer to the end of our time together, you might be wondering, how do we do it? And I like this city. Now, have any of you been to this city, the Civita, I don't speak Italian, whatever. They call it the Civita. And this city is beautiful. It's about 60 miles from Rome. And it's a pretty small city, as you can tell. This isn't like a very zoomed out picture of it. It is that small. It's kind of odd, but only, and it's funny that there's not a real number on this. Different websites say either 10 or 14 people live there. I don't know what happened to those 4 people, but and some even say 10 to 14. So I'm not sure, but they get over 1 million tourists a year to this place. And the only way to get there is that little bridge that you can see right in the middle of the screen. Like you walk over to it. So why is the city so small? You wouldn't build a city for 10 to 14 people. So the mountain under it is eroding. And as landslides happen, it's built on volcanic ash. And so it's not a very firm foundation to build a city on. Now, I want to assure you that if you visit there today, the engineers have reinforced it. You're not going to fall off the city. But until they started doing that, the city would probably have faded into oblivion. It would have eventually all crumbled. And I think this is a great illustration of kind of our modern worldview again, like the iceberg. The city is on top, and it's beautiful. and it's benefiting from things in the past. But as we disregard history, as we forget about the democracy of the dead, all those voices that came before that helped us build our ideas to where they are, as we undercut them, we're getting less and less to actually keep our beautiful city on. And the city's going to run out of room eventually if we don't sustain the foundation under it. It's similar to, and I believe it's in the Abolition of Man, if I'm quoting it right, but where the branch is sawing itself off. That's kind of what's happening here. And then this city, luckily, is being preserved. I guess that UNESCO is involved, so we don't have to worry about that city, but we may have to worry about our city, our ideological city, that we're trying to illustrate here today. So how do we promote this desire, right? That's kind of a major question. Because a lot of you here, I know you're involved in different classical programs, and you may have a classical school in your area. I don't in my area, in Central Vermont. We have a Christian school, but not a classical Christian school. And there's a few other Christian schools around. So how do you promote this desire for classical Christian education? The first thing I want to encourage you with is a quote from Dietrich Bonhoeffer in Life Together. And he suggests that Christian brotherhood is not an ideal which we must realize. It is rather a reality created by God in Christ in which we may participate. So the really cool part about this is that God hasn't forgotten us in New England. I mean, we joke about being like the frozen chosen, right? You've all heard that before. We joke about that, and I mean, we know the numbers, that a lot of the least Christian cities are here in the Northeast. We all know that. But God hasn't forgotten us. And ultimately, we need to be aware of opportunities for fellowship around us. Like we need, in Genesis, God didn't just say, oh, Adam looks lonely, I forgot about him. He made Eve and put Eve with him because he needed a companion. We're going to come back to Genesis in a little bit, but I'd like to suggest to you that really be aware and be open to the possibility that even the people around you that you might not think are interested in this, they might actually be interested in this. I don't think God has put us here for no purpose, but it might not be apparently obvious what that purpose is. Now, moving ahead to another quote from Diana Hlyer. Now, Bandersnatch is a great book for writers. If you're a writer out there, it's a very helpful book about writing and community. But she wrote this: the excitement of creating is followed by desperate self-doubt. Courage and inspiration compete with discouragement and despair. For innovators in general, and for writers in particular, one of the most valuable resources in the midst of these challenges is the presence of resonators. And so I'm glad that you're all here today because we're resonating for each other. We're trying to encourage each other in our pursuits. And hopefully, something really great comes out of this for all of you. Hopefully, either you're encouraged by today, something great happens for your community where you are, but that's what we have to do. We have to now intentionally build communities. So God may put the opportunity right in front of us, but we have to walk through that door. We have to do these things. We have to say, oh, hey, God, you gave me this mission field, you gave me these people, you gave me these children, right? This is obviously about education. They're all right here. What am I going to do? And we have to be really intentional about how we do that. And, well, honestly, and I promise they didn't pay me to put this on the slides, but that's what we're doing here, right? With the Classical Learning Consortium for New England. I hear Tim and Sarah and Heatherly and talk about, and that's where the heart is about here, right? Is intentionally building a community for all of us to benefit from. I know that all the words were deliberately chosen, and I don't know if the for is meant to specifically tell us that it's being handed to us, but that's kind of how I feel about being here today with all of you, that it's an opportunity for all of us to be given to us and to hopefully encourage us. Now, Rod Dreher, you all might have read The Benedict Option. He wrote this, and this is kind of his thesis of the whole book. Rather than wasting energy and resources fighting unwinnable political battles, we should instead work on building communities, institutions, and networks of resistance that can outwit, outlast, and eventually overcome the occupation. So obviously there's a nod to Survivor at the end, but as as we do this, God may put the people for us to the brotherhood. He might set the brotherhood right there in front of us. But that doesn't mean we don't have a part to play. And the intentional building of communities is what we have to do. And that is what Chesterton did in the Democracy of the Dead, because ultimately you're part of a larger community. And I'm going to say this, it's an imaginative community. So the final point, we're cultivating the imagination. George MacDonald, again, he inspired so much of fantasy is indebted to him. In addition to words, he wrote, "For repose is not the end of education, its end is a noble unrest." Yeah, this isn't going to be easy, right? It's a noble unrest. We should not be satisfied. An ever-renewed awakening from the dead, a ceaseless questioning of the past for the interpretation of the future. Sounds a lot like the Democracy of the Dead right there. We're always asking the past. We're listening to those voices. We're having that meeting in a town hall with all these great people from the past, and we're listening to them, and they all get a chance to speak. If you've ever been in a town hall meeting, sometimes you wish people wouldn't speak, but it happens. Sometimes people have a lot to say about town and school budgets, and it takes a while, but, or an urgent of the motions of life, which had better far be accelerated into fever than retarded into lethargy. Now, if we're, now this is weird for some to think about, okay, I'm talking to the past, and what do I do? It's weird to imagine this conversation. Sometimes it might feel weird to imagine that I'm talking to people from thousands of years ago. But this imaginative exercise, and as Scott mentioned it earlier, the imagination is so critical to classical education. We need to help our students understand this idea that no, these people are kind of your friends. Like, they're kind of people that, yes, you could have a conversation with. And no, it's not like me talking to any of you here. It's not quite like that, but I now am privileged enough to have the opportunity to not only read what they said, but maybe in some small way, I can add to the conversation now. And we can inspire that in our students. The final word on any topic really hasn't been written yet, right? There's still more that people are talking about and more that people are able to explore and to question. And like MacDonald said, it's ceaseless. We're not just supposed to say, we're there, we've arrived, we're done. So if you leave here today and you find some great people and you build a classical school and it's awesome, you're not done yet. But it will never be done. And that's the whole point of education. We're not just supposed to hit to an end and lay around. Now, I want to tie us back in conclusion to Genesis 2:15. And this is by the King James. And the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to dress it and to keep it. Now that word keep is interesting. It's the word shamar. And I'm not going to read all of them, but the implication of these words is to guard, to observe, to preserve, to save. And these are really significant concepts, because if we don't intentionally build our communities, we're not going to be in a position to help protect what's good and to protect tradition and to protect the democracy of the dead. Honestly, all it takes is one generation to rewrite history, to wipe out the past, and to forget about it. So part of our job is to help protect those who have gone before in the past. And it's really cool when we do this, because it's not just good and true, but it's also beautiful. Andrew Peterson wrote this. You might know his music or his fantasy novels or whatever else, but he wrote this book about himself. If I had made something beautiful, maybe I could forget for a few moments how drab I was, how useless I felt, how lonely was this dull and lifeless life I had been given. And that dull life included Christianity as I understood it. Now, obviously, this was in a dark time in his life, but what he's suggesting here is that all he had to do was make something beautiful. All he had to do was make something, in his case, it tends to be music or literature, but whatever you do, make something beautiful. And I'd like to suggest for our purposes that unity itself is beautiful. And I'm not talking about the brotherhood of Christians, although that is beautiful and true. I'm talking about more ideological unity. I'm talking about looking into the past, seeing the consistent stream of a discussion from the past to the present. I'm talking about being able to understand the big picture of history, the top of the iceberg, or the whole iceberg, not just the top of the iceberg. I'm suggesting that that city on the hill is a lot more beautiful when it's actually sitting on top of something and not falling to the ground because the foundation came out from under it. I'm suggesting that that unified view of viewing the conversation, viewing the democracy of the dead from the beginning to the past, is actually a beautiful thing. And Stratford Haldane says it really well. I bet a lot of you have read this book. It's a very classically oriented book, Beauty for Truth's Sake. Beauty is a radiance of the true and the good, and it's what attracts us to both. Educators, you're teaching people true things, and you're teaching them good things. I'm encouraging you to help make it beautiful, to help make them beautiful, and the democracy of the dead, I think, is beautiful. Imagine we talk about, I suggested it as like a town hall meeting, but maybe you've had those visions of, oh, you know, when I get to heaven, I want to meet like my spiritual hero. You probably have a spiritual hero that you can't wait to meet when you get to heaven. And what I'm suggesting the democracy of the dead is, you can kind of start having a foretaste of that beautiful thing right now. So thank you all for your time, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.